So here we go. Thank you everybody for attending this Minimum Standards Update project anti-racism and decolonization thematic review. Today we are going to start with the ground rules of INEE webinars. All participants, please keep your audio and video is disabled. Please post your questions using the question and answer function at any time or the chat box. Abdullahi Musiadem, who is also here with us and is part of the INEE Minimum Standards Update team, will record the questions and answers, and he will read and do the questions to the panelists at the end of the webinar. As I mentioned, the session is already being recorded. I already pushed the recorded, and we are going to publish later on the webinar in all media channels from INEE. Closed caption is available in English, and I'm going to enable them at any time. Also, the recording presentation will be shared in the INEE website. Very good. The agenda for today is very simple. We are going to have a small introduction from INEE directors Dean Brooks about INEE commitments on anti-racism and racial equity. We are going to follow with also a small introduction and update about the minimum standards update approach to the decolonization anti-racism, and we are going to follow with the presentation from Seun Adebayo, who is the researcher who has done the anti-racism and decolonization thematic review of the minimum standards. And at the end, we are going to have a questions and answer follow-up. By the moment, Seun Adebayo is experiencing a lot of the technical difficulties with his computer. If he's not able to join us, I will jump in and present the conclusions and findings of the anti-racism and decolonization thematic review. Say that, I will give the floor to Dean Brooks so he can start giving us small update and a small background of INEE commitment on anti-racism and racial equity. Dean, please.
Thank you so much, Ariel. And thank you to everybody who's joined. This is a really important step in the process for updating the INEE Minimum Standards. I would like to encourage all of you to take a look at INEE's commitments to addressing racial inequity, power imbalance, and lack of diverse representation. And share with you that this exercise is part of the ongoing work and process we are going through internally here at INEE as a network. And this is an example of how we're also working with our members to look at INEE's tools and resources to see how we can improve how anti-racism can be reflected in the update process. So I'm actually really looking forward to hearing from the consultants who've been working with us on this. But I'd also like to encourage all of you to take a moment to participate in the survey that went out earlier this week in all 5 languages. That's looking at our membership overall, and to also share that data that you provide is not something that we would be holding on the INEE Secretariat, but we're working with a consulting firm called Darvaja, who would be reviewing the data and pulling together analysis, which will really help us to understand ways in which we might be able to address many of these issues. And I've encouraged all of those on the committee that is supporting this work to join today. As I said, this is a real work in progress, but we're committed to it. And you can go to the website of INEE and read more about the statement. It's actually on the, I'll just tell you, the About INEE page. You'll see a link to it. And we can put that in the chat as well if you'd like to read it in detail. So with that, I don't want to take any more time because I want to hear what we've been learning here, Ariel. So I'm going to hand back over to you and very much looking forward to learning today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean. So as I said in the agenda, the next slide is I'm going to explain how the minimum standards update project approach to all the challenges of cultural diversity, anti-racism, and decolonization. The main objective of the minimum standards update was to bring the minimum standards into the new and evolving international humanitarian context. The current version of the minimum standards is from 2010, and the anti-colonization and anti-racism agenda was not that strong and present at that time as it is nowadays. The update of the minimum standards is not aiming to fundamentally alter or the structures of the domains, but is because are still structurally sound and strong, but is aiming to incorporate all the new developments and topics, themes, and new language that has been occurring since the last 11 years. So in conclusion, the update is an update on content and format and navigation of the handbook. On this side of the screen, you can see a visual and a graphic that explain how we are approaching the cultural diversity and human rights approach. The cultural diversity is based on a UNESCO Declaration of Cultural Diversity and Rights of indigenous population, and the human right, of course, we all recognize human rights as the base and underpinning all the work that humanitarians and development we are doing, and all of us recognize education as a human right. If you can see that this will resemble the INEE wheels of community participation, analysis, and coordination. When we started to plan the minimum standards update, we all in the INEE Secretariat, with the INEE members and with other educational stakeholders, we put a lot of attention and a lot of thinking about how we were going to include all the diversity of cultural languages, contexts that are around are using the minimum standards nowadays in the different contexts and in the different phase of the humanitarian cycle and program development. So we conclude that we need to take a specific consideration on age, gender, and diversity, cultural and linguistics. By this, we mean that we have done online and offline assessment taking into account, and this has been done in the local language of at least 17 countries, plus the 5 INEE official language. And finally, equity participation, meaning that we tried to take into consideration all the diversity of the different genders, race, ethnicities, and different backgrounds and contexts that are already in the different usage of the minimum standards. Of course, this cultural diversity and equity participation approach has limitations because we cannot do an assessment and a consultation with all the language in all the parts of the different countries that have education in emergency situations. Nevertheless, we did our utmost effort to have a representative samples of the different contexts, crises, and cultural backgrounds that are a part of the INEE network and education and emergency and development community. This is the introduction and the approach of how we did the INEE minimum standards consultation to take into consideration anti-racism and decolonization. To do this on a systematic and very methodological approach, we partnered with a consultant who's Seun Adebayo, who is unfortunately still trying to connect, and he was not able to do so. I hope that he can do it at any time, but I'm going to step in and do the presentation. And I'm going to start with the next slide. So what were the goals and the objectives of the minimum standards anti-racism and decolonization review? It was to review and mapping all the reference on anti-racism and decolonization already included in the 22 version, and later on to develop evidence based on a rubric of anti-racism and decolonization in an education framework. Meaning that the first idea was to have a look to the current version and later on look and analyze the current version under the lens of an anti-racism and the decolonization rubric. How this work was done. First, the evidence-based rubric was based on reviewing the minimum standards with the anti-racism and decolonization lens. Later on, based on that, the consultant, Seun, and his team did a full review of literature in, and this is another limitation of the research, that was done in English and French and Spanish. That was the only language that where we review literature about anti-racism and decolonization. Also, and Seun and his team apply indigenous knowledge systems to do a round of consultations with different ethnics and different racial groups to understand what was their approach to the minimum standards and their understanding of the terminology of anti-racism and decolonization lens. So in a summary, the indigenous knowledge system was the methodology used to do this thematic review. Based on that, Seun and his team did an annotated review of the minimum standards where they went through all the chapters, domains, standards, key actions, and action notes, so to annotate and say what were the gaps on these two topics. The third step was, as I explained, the presentation of this gap, and the fourth step was a draft of list of recommended stakeholders for INEE to do a consultation on the anti-racism and anti-decolonization annotated review. How was the rubric developed? As we said, this was developed in evidence-based, as in a review of the literature available by the researchers. The literature review was guided by the following criteria. Was actively searching for the knowledge that challenged Western monopolies of knowledge and practice. There's a strong consideration of position of who was defining the concept and whose interest these conceptualizations are made, meaning that the research was challenging the holders and the powerful holders of the knowledge. We were going to challenge that the power and the knowledge is not always in libraries, in research websites, or in the hands of academic researchers. The rubric base was also engaging in the indigenous knowledge system in identifying what literature and not literature is essential in strengthening the INEE minimum standards. Also, each literature were reviewed to check whether there is a clear recognition of author position, because this thematic review is based on the understanding that each author has a political and intellectual and research position on what is the meaning of anti-colonialism and anti-racism. So we wanted to take into account that background and that position of the different authors. And I would like to reiterate that the research and thematic review was done not only based on written literature available on libraries or the usual channels or academic websites. So these are the steps in a sequence that Seun and his team did to analyze the current literature and screening the indigenous knowledge systems. First, they did a setup to secure a library, who is a way storage of academic and traditional knowledge. Second, a documentation and identification and a screening of that academic literature and non-academic information available. The third step was data extraction of these two sources and finalizing with an analysis and the development of the rubric that I'm going to start to show in the next slide. What is the setup library in Zotero? Is mainly this is the methodological using a reference managed software to include or collect and organize and setting all the resources, again, academic or not academic, that were used on the research and developing on the thematic review. The next step is how the research team did the selection of the database and used the search of the literature. And I'm not going to extend too much on this because it's not my field of expertise. We can go that later on. And as I said, additionally, the research team perform a reference search to identify other relevant articles and sources. And sorry to be repetitive in this, the other relevant articles and sources were not limited to the academic world. So here we are entering to the gray literature, and the concept of gray literature was also challenged because the gray literature include all the sources that were not written or uploaded on the classical research channels. In addition to visiting the websites, organizations, and the presence and engaging and the interviews that the team did with education and emerging stakeholders, they did they did also a round of informations with other people who are managing indigenous knowledge systems as a way of conducting research and analysis. The main time constraint was one of the main challenges because of the revision of the Greek literature, and also the language was also a limitation because, as I said, there was limited to English, Spanish, and some interviews in French. Also, I'm going to go to the next slide, where this is an example of the table and matrix that the researchers take into account and did about all the traditional literature and information available, the great literature, and the indigenous knowledge systems. This is available upon request for researchers who would like to explore the results and the raw data of the anti-colonialism and thematic review. So this I'm going to highlight that the countries covered in the review include Canada, Finland, Australia, South Africa, United States, Denmark, Japan, Ghana, and while regions including Africa, Europe, and Latin America. And in Latin America, there was also a work done with communities that are not able to speak Spanish in Colombia. They are sorry, I'm going to correct myself, with indigenous communities that are bilingual, that they use their original language as the main source of communication and knowledge, and also they are using Spanish because as the main language and official language of the country. So one of the main in the next bullet points, these are one of the main findings of this review, that anti-racism educations tends to be reductive, meaning that tends to do a victimization of the people who are not engaged on the power holders systems. Anti-racism education is also confronted with limited contradictions and ambivalence. This is mainly when the official curriculum are having a position or a declaration that they have an anti-racism approach, but in the implementations, they still use the more traditional Lasalle conduct of the education. The next finding is anti-racism education will be more effective when it's action-oriented and oriented into systemic change to address the issues of racism and social oppression. And this is linked with the previous finding. When the curriculum or the official education policies have statements that they were going to tackle about anti-racism and decolonization, but when in practices, the content and the practice of teachers and education practitioners are not being coherent with the education policy. The next step is the decolonization of education highlights the need to acknowledge indigenous knowledge system as part of dismantling Western monopoly of knowledge production as the only way of knowing. And this is very important to highlight that written and knowledge is one of these main issues, how the anti-racism and anti-colonization thematic review highlight in the way to include indigenous knowledge systems. There is a lot of communities that are not literated, and we don't, in general, educational emergency or official curriculums, they don't take into account their knowledge, background, and culture when producing education and emergency curricula, because it's extremely difficult to gather the information about that knowledge. So I'm going to go to the next slide, and we are going to explain now about the rubric, how the rubric was developed. The objective of the rubric was to help understanding and addressing this inconsistencies, the shortcoming, and the omissions in the 2010 edition of the minimum standards. The scope of the rubric was to cover the main areas of the minimum standards, including the handbook, and also not only the 5 domains, but also the annex and the glossary. And the issue of touching up on the glossary is extremely important, because we are going to, in the minimum standards update, to challenge and to review some of the definitions that are currently in the glossary. So how the rubric can be used is and I'm going to go to the next slide so you can have a vision of how the rubric is developed. So this is a rubric that is can be used to analyze the introduction of the minimum standard handbook. In the first column, you have questions that have been developed using all the background and the methodology that I already explained. In the mid column, we have the annotations on the actions about yes or not about that questions. And in the last column, we have the actions and the guidance how to answer the questions and what we, INEE, should do if the answer is yes, no, or there are notes. So, and we have developed the same rubric for all the standards, domains, and all the section of the minimum standards. In this example, for instance, that we are, I would like to remind that we're still in the introduction of the minimum standards. For instance, this question is about what kind of international legal instruments are referenced in the current version of the minimum standards, and whether these instruments that are quoted in the introduction of the minimum standards take into consideration cultural diversity, racial discrimination, rights of indigenous peoples, and equitable approach to education. And in the actions are the recommendation of the international instruments that should be added to the current version of the minimum standards to take into consideration the questions of the topic described in the first column. For instance, is the International Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, that is very old, that is from 1969 during the decolonization period of United Nations. Also, clearly the Sustainable Development Goals, when the INEE Minimum Standards 2010 versions, we were still using the Millennium Development Goals. And also, as I said, the United Nations Declaration of the Right of Indigenous People, that is from 27, and the UNESCO Universal Declaration of Cultural Diversity, that even when they are from 2007 and 2001, were not taken into consideration during the 2010 update of the minimum standards. Say that, we are going to have another example of the domain 1, the foundational standards of the questions and the actions that should be taken into consideration when applying the rubric to the minimum standards. And this is about the engaging and involving the local stakeholders and indigenous knowledge across all the stage. And it's important to highlight that engaging local stakeholders is not the same that engaging indigenous knowledge system, because indigenous knowledge system is a horizontal system, and a lot of the situations local stakeholders are also representing the power holders. So indigenous knowledge system is a way to make the commitment and the community engagement more horizontal. So I'm not going to be repetitive, and the rubric is available for anybody who would like to engage and try to apply it for different cases. Also, COVID-19 was also taken into consideration because all the COVID-19 and distance education was an example on how restructuring and analyzing who was the power holder in having the education policy and delivering education. We are here on the rubric of domain 3, teaching and learning. And I'm going to give this example of the rubric on this example of how we can include indigenous knowledge systems. The question in this case is, are stories of anti-racism highlighted as one of the way of teachers ensure students' active engagement in learning and critical thinking? If not, we need to include and telling stories of the learnings as active engagement that include the own knowledge of these communities. And I'm going to make a stop here and remind all of the participants and ourselves that the main way to analyze and assess whether a story or a situation is engaged or anti-racism or has racist context is always referring to the human rights instruments that are available and are acceptable and are applicable to any context, any culture, and any language. That's why they are universal. And say that I want to do another remark that this research did not challenge the universality of the human rights. We know and we are very much aware that are a lot of literature and a lot of researchers that always challenge the way that the universal human rights were developed and applied as a Western way of colonizing different contexts. Nevertheless, INEE and this research was started based on the validity and the universality of the human rights as an instrument to use as a background and a platform for all our analysis that includes the education as a human right. This is domain 4, teachers and education personnel. And this is very important because it's also linked to the accreditation of the teachers, and the teachers that are accredited by the formal system are the ones who has gone through the traditional system. But the idea of this rubric is to analyze how the teachers or the people on the community that has local and indigenous knowledge can be also be presented, maybe not in the formal system, but in the non-formal education system as teachers and ways of transmitting the knowledge to all the learners and the rest of the community. This is the domain 5 of education policy. And also this was, and I'm going to spend some, sorry, I'm going to do some stop in this item that thus the guidance notes of the education policy domain and standards highlights the importance and appreciation of diverse and local knowledge sources in education policy making. That if the answer when we analyze the domain education policy number 5 and related standard is not, when we do the writing, we need to highlight the importance and appreciation of including this system and knowledge in all education policies from governments and from intragovernmental agencies and bodies. And here we are entering to the last part of the rubric that is about the glossary. That is extremely important because it set up the ground for the common understanding of the terminology. And I'm going to also highlight only the first one about the definition of key concept, where they actively challenge the current stereotypes and who is defining this key concept, for whose these interests are these definitions are made. So if you remember when we started the presentation of this webinar, or one of the parts of this webinar, we said that this thematic review has one of the understanding was that every author and every researcher has a definition and has a political stand, what is anti-racism and what is decolonization. And when we say a political stand, we are talking not about political parties, but we are talking about the compendium of political knowledge, social knowledge, and cultural background that make that position. In a way, we are challenging the standard that the knowledge is neutral. This research start with challenging that assumption. That is, of course, the challenging that the knowledge is not neutral is not new, but we and the researcher use the methodology that's saying that if there is a method and there is an objective, there is a way to do the research, even taking position upon this position is always clarify and start and make clear from the beginning. So how the rubric can be used. As we said, is need to be applied side by side with the minimum standards handbook. And I'm going to finalize this presentation highlighting the key gaps in anti-racism and decolonizations that are in the recommendations for the minimum standards update. So the first one is to summarize the status of anti-racism and decolonization in education as currently represented in the minimum standards. The second is the strengths that are currently in the minimum standards handbook version of 2010, because it has been done in a very participatory and inclusive way by the consultation that took place in 2010. The other is the gaps or weakness in the content and language, specifically more in language than in content, because the language and the understanding of the meaning of the language has evolved but has changed a lot in the last 10 years. So in this, this is a summary of the summary of the key gaps and recommendations. The first one is that INEE and we as INEE community and a network, we need to engage more with weak concepts such as equity, race, power relations, cultural diversity, inclusion, racism, indigenous knowledge, discrimination. The second one is, and we already highlighted this, so I'm not going to repeat this, the need to include the relevant international legal binding instruments about the topic. And the last one, that is the glossary, needs to be updated to include definition of context and concepts such equitable education, indigenous knowledge systems, injustice, stereotypes, discrimination, prejudice, equitability, decolonization, racism, and anti-racism. So this is the draft list of the stakeholders, and again I apologize in behalf of Seun Adebayo that was meant to be here today but could not make it due to some connectivity issues. So I'm going to
Ariel,
stop
sorry.
sharing. Yeah, Abdullahi.
The Seun has joined it and he had
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will let Seun step in to finalize the webinar. Thank you very much to everybody.
Hi, thanks a lot, Ariel, and thank you, everyone. Apologies for the technical difficulty. It was quite unforeseen. So like Ariel shared, the consultancy that I did on the thematic review on anti-racism, there were major 4 deliverables. The first one was an evidence-based rubric that can be useful for the MS minimum standards reviewers to review the minimum standards from an anti-racism and decolonization perspective. And the second was also an annotated review of the minimum standards. As Ariel shared, there were some shortcomings and recommendations that were made from my review, from the annotated review. And I'm looking forward to the questions and the discussion now.
So do you want me to share any of the slides in particular?
I think if there are questions, then I can just respond to questions.
Yeah. So Abdullahi, please, if you can help us in stating the question that has been posted in the chat box or in the question and answers, please.
Thank you, Ariel. There is no questions. There was one Isa Fadil Far, who was asking about translation in Arabic. But there was no so far any questions from the members. So I would like to take this opportunity to ask the participants if they have questions or comments. Please share them now or maybe in the chat box.
Thank you very much, Abdullahi. Meanwhile, the participants try to do their questions in the chat box and the questions and answers. Seun, I will ask you to please, if you can summarize the experience, the challenges, and the highlights of your research and thematic review.
Thank you so much, Ariel, and thanks everyone for joining this webinar. I think that the experience in summary was quite enlightening, and to see the importance of reflecting on anti-racism and decolonization in education and the complexities surrounding this area, particularly is relevance for the minimum standards. So in summary, it was good to see that there's quite a lot that could be included in the minimum standards to reflect anti-racism and decolonization values, and also good that INEE is looking at this as a long-term commitment to pursue the values of anti-racism and decolonization when particularly in education emergencies. Some of the challenges that I encountered while doing this thematic review was the representation of knowledge in this area itself, because in the beginning of the literature review, and I believe Ariel must have mentioned, I was quite intentional in challenging the Western monopoly of knowledge production by engaging indigenous knowledge systems and values in identifying literature that speaks to the topic of anti-racism and decolonization. However, of the 160 literature that was downloaded, I was able to review about 36 of them. And most of these articles were even in English, which sort of reflects the dominance of the English language when it comes to international education, knowledge production, and dissemination processes. So very difficult to find from a scan of literature on the internet, knowledge from indigenous knowledge systems and settings that can inform this important area of anti-racism and decolonization. And also talking about the positionality of authors in this research field. Part of the findings of the literature review was also being a bit challenged to see that very few of the authors researching anti-racism and decolonization in education actually reflected on their positionality. And I strongly believe that understanding of authors kind of give nuances to the findings, interpretation of the findings in studies on anti-racism and decolonization in education. So I think those were the highlights in summary for me.
Thank you very much, Seun. Abdullahi, I don't see any questions on the chat box or neither on the questions and answer, except one in Arabic.
Yes, there is no question so far, but maybe if the members can raise their hand and ask questions, that will be helpful.
Yes. If anybody has a question, please type in the chat box. I remind everybody that the audio and the video for the participant is not enabled. Ahmad, I see that you are saying hello. If you have any questions, please go ahead. Dean?
Yeah, so Seun, really good to see you there. And looks like you're in a beautiful courtyard. I don't know if that's real, but it's gorgeous. And where are you calling us from, Seun?
So
Where are you at?
I'm based in Ireland,
Oh, okay,
Galway
nice.
Island. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm curious, because sometimes, it's an ongoing work that we're doing at INEE. And one thing we hope to be working with another group is a kind of primer on a lot of the language, because there's a lot of terms that I think you're using them as well, and positionality and decolonia, how do we keep track of all that? And as you were going through that review process, did you have like almost like a glossary that you were using, or was there something that was helping you to think through all of these? Because there seems to be a lot of terms. I don't know, but that's just
Yeah.
something I've been noticing. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dean. Like I mentioned earlier about the complexities of even filtering the literature in this
Yeah.
area. There are so many intersectionalities with gender, race, class, social
Yeah.
systems. So it's not quite a very straightforward area. So when we're talking about concepts and terminologies, and the rubric that was developed, which was
Mm-hmm.
to serve as a practical document that can be useful for the MS writers or
Yeah.
reviewers, in making changes to the minimum
Mm-hmm.
standards. One of the things I recommended was to actually, question the source of knowledge and where do we get, the knowledge that defines these terms and these
Mm-hmm.
concepts. Who are
Mm-hmm.
defining these concepts that are being, engaged with even in the minimum standards. So,
Mm-hmm.
like I mentioned, from the onset of the consultancy was to engage indigenous knowledge system, having a greater level of representation of indigenous values and
Mm-hmm.
scholars from the global south, scholars that
Mm-hmm.
are from areas where the minimum standards is being used, sort of a
Right.
representation of their voices, because I believe that how we define a concept determines how we engage with that concept and the
Mm-hmm.
resulting impact of the concept. So it wasn't quite very easy or straightforward, but just being very intentional on who is defining this concept, what and how is it
Mm-hmm.
defined, and that's why I also questioned the positionality of authors and just
Mm-hmm.
looking at the whole knowledge production. So I believe that one of the ways of addressing this complexity is to have the diversity of voices,
Yeah.
particularly representation from areas that engage with INEE's minimum standards,
Mm-hmm.
particularly.
Mm-hmm. So that's such a good point. And I think the rubric has the potential to be used for other resources as well. I think that's also what I find exciting. Yeah. I
Absolutely.
think there's another question or a comment. Is that from Rachel?
Rachel just posted the link to the survey that you mentioned at the beginning, Ding.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
We want to encourage those on the call
Mhm.
to participate in that survey. But yeah, I mean, do you see the potential for the rubric to, could it be adapted for other tools and resources, for example? Do you think there's that potential?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there is potential for that. But this particular rubric was targeted towards the
Mhm.
minimum standards,
Mhm.
as I already displayed. Just a snapshot of the rubric itself. So across the five domains, the introduction and the glossaries, there
Mhm.
were questions that were developed from the review of literature and evidence available on the
Mhm.
topic. So those questions are to trigger changes, reflections, and possible review of some sections in the minimum standard itself. So this
Mhm.
can be a tool that can be used for other guidance notes or outputs of our INEE.
Mhm.
Just to ask some questions: Is are we actually acknowledging the diversity of knowledge? Who is defining this knowledge? Are we inclusive of actors, within this framework. Yeah.
No, that's excellent.
Thank you very much, Dean, for your two questions. And again, there's still time for anybody of any participant who would like to do another questions. If not, the final
There's a
remarks.
question, Ariel, from
There's a question here.
Julia. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Julia is asking, thank you very much for the excellence and very informative presentation. Given all MS updates are interrelated based on the literature review, basically, is it, okay, just 1 minute. Yes. I don't think I'm seeing the, yes. Do you think it lends itself best for making these changes in our work? Like basically, how can we reflect this in our work? Is that how the question is?
Yeah, I would just try to attempt the question, and if I didn't get it clearly, Julia, maybe you can further elaborate. So thanks a lot for the question. I believe that the rubric itself covers all the major sections of the rubric that was developed from the literature review, covers the various sections of the minimum standards. So I believe that there are changes that could be implemented in different sections. Even the introduction, for example, one of the recommendations was an inclusion of international legal instruments like the rights of culturally diverse groups and some indigenous knowledge, international legal instruments. So in each of the sections, there are actually changes that could be made from the literature review, which was presented in the form of the rubric. Yeah.
So it cuts across all the domains. It's not specific to
all
one
the domains, including the introduction and the glossary.
Seun, I have a question from my end. You said several times that all this thematic review interlink and cross also with a lot of issues of gender and other type of terminology. Can you expand a little more about that intersections?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ariel, for that. I think talking about the intersectionalities of researching anti-racism and decolonization in education, I think it's quite just important to acknowledge that it's not a very straightforward process, and it's not something that can be done. It's not a short-term engagement. So the intersectionalities highlights the importance of engaging, the work of anti-racism and decolonization as a lifelong learning process, and not something that can be like the conversation that I had with you during the consultancy was, is this something that INEE just want to get done within a couple of months? But you talked about INEE's commitment, going forward. So being able to address gender, because gender itself is seen differently across various contexts that the minimum standards is being implemented. So being able to find a common ground is quite a challenge. Gender may be seen differently in Middle East than is being perceived in Europe, for example. So these challenges are important to reflect on in the long term. Yeah.
The
Thank
last
you very much,
question
Seun.
from Yemen, and Ahmed is asking how to prioritize the INEE minimum standards in Yemen context.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, Ahmed. I'm not so familiar with Yemen context, but the idea of the minimum standards is to be used as a tool for all education and emergency actors. we can start to work. I mean, I hope that different agencies working there, like NRC, Save the Children, UNICEF, UNESCO, UNHCR, we trust that they are prioritizing the minimum standards as INEE instruments and tools as a way of delivering and mainstreaming education and emergency in a conflict-affected country like Yemen. But your question is incredibly difficult to answer.
Yeah, just to add to that, Ariel, I mean, Ahmed, I mean, you as well. I mean, the minimum standards are all of our, they're for all of us. So take time to read them, think about them as hopefully principles and guidance that can inform your work. And if you are in coordination meetings or talking with other colleagues, it's one way to come together, because all of our agencies, we all work together to create the standards. So sometimes I found over the years, you just have to remind people, hey, we have these standards, we all worked on them. Let's talk about them,
I will add that Ahmed is the INEE focal point for Yemen. So,
good. Okay.
So
Perfect.
even having you in there is one of the ways that INEE as a network is trying to do as the effort of diversifying and taking forward the minimum standards and the whole INEE work. Then I guess that the having INEE focal points in different countries in different languages is one of the main strong commitments and one of the main achievements of INEE as a network of diversifying and taking into account different languages and contexts.
Yeah. I know it's so key. And Ahmed, sorry, I didn't recognize that was you, but I just to say, I think, and it's great to hear you'll have a workshop. And I also think it's something you can just talk about in the day-to-day work. I think back to years back with, when I was working with a large team, we would actually use the minimum standards as kind of a discussion point for our staff meetings. And it would help us improve our response. In that example, we talked about community participation, and we realized we hadn't actually spoken with the youth in our program before we started implementing the classes. So we stopped and we went back and we held focus groups, and our programs were stronger as a result. And so, the standards were a reminder of how we could improve the quality of our work. So just, all of those examples and finding ways to incorporate it is excellent. But thank you for raising that. And so good to hear about this work, and looking forward to going through the rubrics more closely and thinking about how we can continue this. Thank you so much.
Dean, thank you very much for your participation. We already reached the hour schedule for this webinar. For my end, also, I would like to thank all the participants for their commitment and their engagement on a topic like this. And from the minimum standards point of view, this is not a one-time effort and one-time engagement. This is work and engagement that we will keep on time, because we know that achieving results on anti-racism and decolonizations will take time. From my end, that's all. Seun, if you want to have any final closing words for finalizing this webinar, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ariel and for Dean and for other participants. I think I really must acknowledge INEE's efforts in engaging the issues of anti-racism and decolonization, and also understanding that this is a long-term commitment, and the complexities are surrounding these issues need to be given time and effort. So yeah, thank you very much. It was great to be part of the MS update project.
Thank you, everybody. To finalize, I remind everybody that this webinar has been recorded and will be available in INEE webpage. And also, we can engage any of you with me or with Seun through the INEE contact email. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you next time in the next webinar from INEE. Have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone.